Hey, today I'm just going to talk because I've had a lot on my mind ever since I went down this rabbit hole when I made these videos about whether the universe is conscious, about what is often called panpsychism. I mean, I thought it was just a fascinating thing that's been coming up more and more recently because of challenges to materialism and to physicality and to questions that are being raised by artificial intelligence and whether AIs might be conscious. But I was wrong. I believe now that questions about the consciousness of the universe are actually the same questions that are raised by the topic of consciousness itself. And so much depends on what is right about this. I mean, your entire view of reality, your entire understanding of yourself, of the universe, and of reality depend on what kinds of answers you have to these questions. And I'm not even convinced yet that we can have answers that we can rely on. But I am convinced that the ubiquitous materialist answers to these questions don't stand on the firm intellectual footing that many assume they do. Let me try to explain what I mean, but it's not easy. On the one hand, I've been someone who does have a materialist point of view, an assumption that tables and chairs are made of physical stuff, and I don't know what else there is but physical stuff. And I've done what I think most people and most scientists do, especially in the culture that I'm from, which is walk around with the assumption that physicality is all there is, and that everything stems from that. We think about the brain and all its complexity, and it's very commonsensical to believe that somehow, in ways we don't fully understand, but maybe one day will, that the functioning of the brain results in the mind, and that the brain is the mind, and the mind is some manifestation of the physical functioning of the brain. And it seems sometimes like a minor technicality, a trifling matter, maybe even an inconvenience, that what we really have is a correlation between the brain and the mind. There's this assumption, and I think it's an assumption that's really impossible to adequately evaluate, that this correlation is not merely correlation, but it's really in some way causal, because culturally the idea is so strong that everything is material. Now, I'm a lover of physics and of science, but we don't make formulas in physics that include a mental coefficient, that really reckon with the relationship between physicality and consciousness. And I really think that it's easy to just go on living ignoring the fact that from a Western scientific or intellectual point of view, we really don't know how to regard consciousness, whether our own or that of the universe or that of matter, and to integrate something of that into our notion of what reality really is. And it's so easy to elide over it as if this is not a serious problem. But when you think about it, it's a very serious problem. It's one of the most fundamental problems because it goes to the heart of our thinking about the nature of ourselves and of the universe. I said that on the one hand, I've been a dedicated physicalist, and at one time I was a budding neuroscientist, so I do know a fair amount about the brain. But the other part of that sentence was going to be that at one time I thought a lot about the fundamental limitations of our understanding of consciousness and experience. Like many people, I've had my own experiences with extreme states of mind, ones that differ markedly from those of everyday mental life. And I've observed a great deal of the manifestations of brain injuries, of mental illnesses, of psychosis, and I've had my own experiences of self and selflessness, which are also puzzling adventures in consciousness. And then for a long time I did what I think people do, which is recognize that there are many unanswered questions about consciousness, that these call out for answers. And then I went and had breakfast, and I did the dishes, and a long time passed, and I started thinking about the consciousness of the universe. And now I realize that I'm right back before breakfast again. One of the great things that's happened since I started making these videos is that I've heard from a lot of interested and interesting people who have helped me learn and have pointed out new directions in my own thinking. And while I was looking at what you might call the new panpsychism, what I came to see is that there are many scholars who are thinking deeply about these issues. Scholars who I hadn't been aware of. And I don't mean largely those who are thinking about these things within scientific circles, and I also don't mean those who are thinking about these things particularly from an Eastern or Buddhist point of view, or from a spiritual point of view. I mean people who are thinking about these things from a philosophical stance. In other words, thinking about the underpinnings in Western thought about consciousness and mentality. I said I was going down a rabbit hole, but what I think it really is a call to arms. I once knew how important this subject was, and while I was washing the dishes, I temporarily let it go, and when I finished washing the dishes, it was a few decades later, and I realized that there's a tremendous amount of scholarship that has gone into thinking about consciousness and reality in ways that don't elide over it, that attempt to deal with it directly, and that what it means to be in this rabbit hole is that I feel a need to elaborate a more coherent position to the extent that that's possible. Does consciousness exert a causal role in the universe? What can we say about the nature and ontology of consciousness? What about the idealist position that, as some suggest, everything is consciousness and that all the manifestations that we see in physicality ultimately stem from consciousness? Or do the material universe and consciousness arise somehow together, ultimately from the same source? And what about experience? For many years I have felt that experience was not a reliable guide to what's ultimately true, because we can have any experience imaginable. Our minds are that flexible and nimble and creative, and experience ultimately can mislead us. Here's another thought I've been having lately. I'm questioning the role of our intuitions in general in thinking about consciousness. I wonder whether questions of consciousness have something in common with the physics of the early part of the 20th century. Newtonian mechanics, for example, worked beautifully until you got to realms of experience that were not part of everyday human life. So Einstein's special theory of relativity came along, and counterintuitively it told us that events that were simultaneous to one observer were not simultaneous to another observer. Relativity describes events that occur close to the speed of light, so thus in a realm of experience that's very far from everyday human experience. And quantum mechanics too holds true, but describes a reality that's very, very far from everyday human experience. I wonder whether our intuitions about consciousness are unreliable in a similar way, that our common sense notions about consciousness may not hold, and that we need to go beyond our intuitions in order to gain a more full understanding of consciousness. Anyway, as I said, I went down the rabbit hole, and now I've got a whole lot of trouble and a whole lot of questions, and it's all very, very rich. Be sure to subscribe. You can follow my Instagram, and thanks a lot for watching.